Let's now consider the challenges for Craig's view. In my last speech, I pointed out that to believe Craig's view, you'd have to believe that the fact that you could stop 1,000,000 Holocausts simply by lifting a finger is not sufficient by itself to make it morally wrong for you to take a nap instead. You'd also have to believe that without God, there's nothing evil in 1,000,000 Holocausts.
As St. Anselm saw, God is, by definition, the greatest conceivable being, and therefore perfectly good. The question before us this evening is, what is the best account of the objectivity of moral values and duties? What makes certain actions objectively good or evil, right or wrong? In tonight's debate, I'm going to defend two basic contentions. First, theism provides a sound foundation for the objectivity of moral values and duties. Second, atheism does not provide as sound a foundation as theism for the objectivity of moral values and duties. So let's look at that first contention together. Here, I want to examine two subpoints with you. First, theism provides a sound foundation for the objectivity of moral values. Moral values have to do with what is good or evil. On the theistic view, objective moral values are grounded in God. As St. Anselm saw, God is, by definition, the greatest conceivable being, and therefore perfectly good. He is not merely perfectly good, he is the paradigm of moral value. God's own holy and loving character supplies the absolute standard against which all things are measured. He is, by nature, loving, generous, faithful, kind, and so forth. Thus, if God exists, moral values are objective, being wholly independent of human beings. Second, theism provides a sound foundation for the objectivity of moral duties. On a theistic view, objective moral duties are constituted by God's will or commands. God's moral nature is expressed in relation to us in the form of divine commandments, which constitute our moral duties or obligations. Far from being arbitrary, God's commandments must be consistent with his holy and loving nature. Our duties, then, are constituted by God's commandments, and these, in turn, reflect his essential character. On this foundation, we can affirm the objective rightness of love, generosity, and self-sacrifice, and condemn as objectively wrong selfishness, hatred, abuse, and oppression. In summary, then, theism grounds the objectivity of both moral values and moral duties. Hence, it's evident that if God does exist, we have a sound foundation for the objectivity of moral values and duties. Let's turn then to my second contention, that atheism does not provide as sound a foundation for the objectivity of moral values and duties. I'm not going to argue this point in general. Rather, I want to look specifically at Dr. Wielenberg's view, which he calls godless normative realism, and ask whether it provides as sound a foundation for morality as theism. I'm going to argue that godless normative realism not only involves extravagant metaphysical commitments, which make it very implausible, but it also faces a number of formidable objections as an account of objective moral values and duties. First, godless normative realism involves extravagant metaphysical claims which make it very implausible. Because Dr. Wielenberg wants to affirm the objectivity and even necessity of moral values and duties, he cannot take them to be mere byproducts of biological evolution or social conditioning. Rather, he must find some transcendent ground for the objectivity of moral values and duties. He finds this in moral Platonism. His view is akin to mathematical Platonism, which holds that in addition to the world of concrete objects, there exists a transcendent realm of immaterial, causally effete, abstract objects like numbers, sets, and other mathematical entities. Most of us think that such entities have at most a sort of conceptual reality. But for the Platonist, these objects are objectively real. Wielenberg holds that moral values are similarly abstract objects of some sort, existing independently of human beings. When the right physical situations occur in the world, these abstract objects supervene on the situations. So, for example, the abstract object, goodness, supervenes on two people's loving each other, so that their loving each other is objectively good. Platonism is a metaphysical view which is so extravagant that it makes theism, which itself involves hefty metaphysical commitments, look modest by comparison. The prominent metaphysician Peter van Inwagen explains, the Platonist must think of objects of what there is as falling into two exclusive and exhaustive categories, the abstract and the concrete. If X falls into one of these categories and Y into the other, then no two things could be more different than X and Y. The differences between God and this pen pale into insignificance when they are compared with the differences between this pen and the number 4. Indeed, the number seems no more like the pen than like God. The difference between any abstract object and any concrete object would seem to be the maximum difference any two objects could display. Given this strange bifurcation of reality into these two causally unconnected domains, it would be much more credible to suppose that one of the categories is empty. But concrete objects are indisputably real and well understood, in contrast to abstract objects. So, Van Inwagen maintains, the presumption should be that abstract objects do not exist. Nominalism of some sort is thus the default position. Indeed, Van Inwagen believes one should not believe in abstract objects unless one feels rationally compelled by some weighty consideration or argument. A philosopher should wish not to be a Platonist if it's rationally possible for the informed philosopher not to be a Platonist. The objectivity of moral values cannot itself provide such a rationally compelling reason, since Dr. Wielenberg acknowledges that he has no rationally compelling arguments either for the objectivity of moral values or for moral Platonism. He thus cannot overcome the presumption against Platonism and hence against godless normative realism. The theist, by contrast, faces no such obstacle because he grounds moral values in a concrete object, namely God, and so is not committed to a realm of abstract.
Craig claims that God provides the only solid foundation for objective moral values and duties. But this idea collapses under scrutiny. First, grounding morality in God's character creates what's known as the Euthyphro dilemma. Is something good because God commands it, or does God command it because it's good? If morality depends on God's will, then it's arbitrary. God could declare cruelty or genocide good, and we'd be forced to accept it. If God commands things because they're already good, then morality exists independently of God, which defeats Craig's entire point. Second, Craig criticizes Wielenberg's view for being metaphysically extravagant, but belief in a timeless, immaterial, all-powerful being who created the universe is hardly modest. In fact, philosophers like Graham Oppy and J. L. Mackie argue that postulating moral facts is actually less speculative than inventing an invisible deity to explain them. And third, we don't need a God to explain why abuse or oppression is wrong. Evolutionary biology, cognitive science, and social cooperation offer strong, natural explanations for why humans develop shared moral norms. Studies from Franz de Waal and Michael Tomasello show empathy, fairness, and even altruism in non-human primates. Morality doesn't need religion to exist. It needs minds capable of valuing others.
Let's now consider the challenges for Craig's view. In my last speech, I pointed out that to believe Craig's view, you'd have to believe that the fact that you could stop 1 million Holocausts simply by lifting a finger is not sufficient by itself to make it morally wrong for you to take a nap instead. You'd also have to believe that without God, there's nothing evil in 1 million Holocausts. You may have noticed that Craig didn't dispute these implications of his view. Indeed, he didn't mention them at all. His only reply here is that, quote, "The ultimate source of our moral obligations is far beyond our experience," end quote. So I say that the fact that you could stop 1 million Holocausts simply by lifting a finger is sufficient by itself to make it morally wrong for you to take a nap instead. Craig says that it might seem that way, but really it takes an order from God to render that nap immoral. Second, Craig's view makes the occurrence of morally wrong acts inexplicable, because by commanding us to do what he knows we won't do anyway, God would only create more evil. In my last speech, I pointed out a simple defect in Craig's attempt to answer this challenge. Craig didn't address this defect in his last speech, so I'll just remind you of it. Suppose I perform some evil act, like heartlessly ignoring the suffering child. Craig says that because I deserve to be punished for my evil act, God must forbid the act so that he can then punish me. The problem, again, is that if the act deserves punishment because it is evil, then God is justified in punishing me for the evil act without first forbidding the act. As I said in my last speech, if I deserve punishment for ignoring the child even without a divine command, then God can simply punish me. The command is superfluous. Third, the presence of psychopaths in the world creates a contradiction within Craig's view. Psychological research shows that whether or not psychopaths know the difference between right and wrong, they are incapable of grasping the authority of morality. Remember that in trying to explain how God could impose obligations on people who don't believe in him, Craig proposed that by giving non-believers an intuitive grasp of morality's demands and authority, God is able to get his commands through and impose moral obligations on non-believers. However, because psychopaths cannot grasp morality's authority, God hasn't imposed any moral obligations on them, which means that, on Craig's view, they have no moral obligations. In a striking turn of events, Dr. Craig, despite having railed for years against atheism's inability to account for the moral wrongness of the acts of psychopaths, and having declared tonight that Christianity teaches that God has written the demands of his moral law on the hearts of all people, now entertains the possibility that psychopaths do not know the difference between right and wrong and are not culpable for their evil acts. But remember that in his flawed attempt to explain wrong action, Craig said that it was unacceptable for evildoers to get away with evil, and that God would never permit such a thing. Here are Craig's own words, quote, "By issuing general commands to humankind, God is able to hold those who do evil acts responsible for their actions. Without such commands, evildoers could act with impunity and face no divine judgment, for they wouldn't have done anything wrong. They would literally get away with murder, which is unacceptable," end quote. So Craig must hold that psychopaths are culpable for their evil acts, and so do have moral obligations. For otherwise, some psychopaths would, as he puts it, literally get away with murder. We can now see that Craig has painted himself into a corner in tonight's debate. Since psychopaths are incapable of recognizing morality's authority, Craig must deny that they have moral obligations. Yet he must also hold that God doesn't let them get away with their evil acts, and so they do have moral obligations. I hope you will listen carefully to Dr. Craig's closing remarks and pay careful attention to what, if anything, he says about the three challenges I've just explained. The first two challenges show that Craig's view has deeply implausible implications, including that there are no wrong actions and that the fact that you could stop 1 million Holocausts simply by lifting a finger is not sufficient by itself to make it morally wrong for you to take a nap instead. The third challenge is even more serious because it reveals a contradiction in Craig's position. Craig's position leads to the impossible view that psychopaths both do and do not have moral obligations. Please listen carefully to what, if anything, Dr. Craig has to say about these three challenges in his closing remarks.
Wielenberg exposes a dangerous flaw in Craig's view. If morality depends entirely on God's command, then without God, even something like stopping 1 million Holocausts wouldn't actually be morally required. That's not just absurd, it's deeply unsettling. We don't need a divine order to know that letting millions suffer when we could help is wrong. Our moral intuitions, combined with reason and empathy, are more than enough, and that's supported by evolutionary psychology and neuroscience. Studies from institutions like Oxford and Harvard have shown that human brains are wired with empathy, fairness, and harm avoidance, even in infants, long before they're taught religion. Wielenberg also highlights the contradiction in Craig's logic with psychopaths. Psychologists like Dr. Kent Keel have proven that many psychopaths can't experience moral emotions like guilt or understand moral responsibility the way others do. If Craig is right, they're not morally obligated. But if they aren't, then according to Craig's own words, they get away with murder. That completely undermines the idea that God's commands are a consistent moral framework. In reality, Wielenberg's godless moral realism fits better with what we observe in the real world. Our moral sense doesn't require a supernatural source to exist or to matter.
Does your view address cases where moral duties conflict? For example, the classic case of lying to protect Jews from Nazi soldiers that appear at your door.
Yeah, so the way the view I hold, the sort of where what is morally required of us depends on what moral reasons we have, is similar to the view put forward by the early 20th century philosopher W.D. Ross. So the basic idea is morality is kind of messy. There are all these different things that provide moral reasons for us to do certain things or not do certain things. And it's when you're trying to figure out what to do, a lot of times it's just a matter of weighing these reasons against each other. And so I would think in that case, I mean, that's just a particularly difficult case in the sense that you've got sort of weighty moral reasons on both sides, and it may be very difficult to know what the right thing to do is. So there are a lot of easy cases, like if you've promised to meet someone for lunch, and here's a classic example from philosophy land, filled with drowning babies. So you've promised to meet someone for lunch, you're passing through philosophy land, here's a drowning baby. If you save the baby, you'll break the promise. There it seems clear that the reason to the importance of saving the baby outweighs the promise. But there are other cases that are harder. I think if the question is about conflicting duties, I would think of those cases as cases where you just have weighty reasons on both sides, and it's hard to tell what your duty is, but there wouldn't literally be conflicting duties. There would be one actual obligation. It can just be very hard to know what it is when you've got weighty reasons sort of pulling in conflicting directions.
It seems to me that this highlights the problem of trying to derive moral obligations from simply normative considerations of weighing the moral values of alternative actions. Indeed, it makes me wonder what the situation with psychopaths would be on this sort of view, since they wouldn't be capable, in many cases I should think, of weighing the moral norms required to have an obligation. Certainly mentally retarded people and infants and people in comatose conditions would not be able to derive moral obligations in that way. Whereas I would say on my view, I was talking about normal moral agents, not mentally ill people, comatose people, little infants, mentally retarded. That's what I meant when I was referring to being written on the hearts of all people, was normal moral agents.
Okay, Dr. Craig, the next question is for you. The questioner asks, why should we obey God's commands? Where does that should come from? How is that should grounded in God?
Right. This relates to the question that came up a little bit in the debate about whether or not your moral theory has some sort of explanatory ultimate which cannot be further explained. And it seems to me the divine command theorist could say simply that this is my theory, that divine commands constitute our moral obligations, and therefore the question arises, doesn't even arise, well, why should I obey God's commands? Because that just is the theory that you're giving, and this is an explanatory ultimate that doesn't have a further explanation. Seems to me that would be perfectly legitimate move. But he could say something else. He could say that we are to obey God's commands because God has commanded us to. And that would not be viciously circular. For example, all of the things mentioned in the debate tonight is itself mentioned in the debate tonight. So there are things that are included in themselves. And if God issues a command, you shall obey all of my commands, that command itself would be comprised in that command. And so in this case, you're not left with some sort of brute explanatory ultimate. Rather, you would have an explanation for why you should obey God's commands, because God has commanded you to obey all his commands, including that one. So it seems to me that that would be a perfectly acceptable answer to the question that was raised by the questioner.
Okay, so I think this question is helpful. It brings out another sort of important parallel between, I think, mine and Craig's view, and actually, as far as I can tell, anybody who wants to believe in objective moral truths or facts, which is, at some point, you're going to need a moral axiom, where you have some basic moral claim or principle which has no further explanation outside of itself. And so I think sometimes in debates between theists and atheists about morality, it's presented this way: well, on the theist view, God is the foundation, then on the atheist view, they sort of have no foundation. That's very misleading. I think both views require moral axioms. The only difference is which moral axioms. On the particular question of why obey God's commands, I would just point out that the sort of most prominent defenders of divine command theory, for example, Robert Adams, they realize that this is a very pressing question. Robert Adams spends a lot of time trying to provide reasons to obey God's commands, and in doing so, he inevitably, predictably appeals to unexplained, brute moral axioms. So I think you can't get away from it.
Wielenberg is absolutely right. Every moral system has to start somewhere. But the moment Craig says, obey God because God said so, he's admitting that his foundation is just as unexplained. Worse, it's circular. He defines morality by God's will, then defines God's will as moral. That's not moral reasoning, that's obedience. Now compare that to Wielenberg's view. He says some moral truths, like suffering without justification is wrong, are self-evident, not because we feel them, but because they're rationally compelling. This idea has deep roots in moral philosophy. Thinkers like G.E. Moore and Christine Korsgaard argue that some values don't need grounding in a deity. They're built into the structure of reason itself. And science backs this up. Research from developmental psychologists like Paul Bloom shows that even babies, as young as 6 months, can recognize helpful versus harmful behavior. They prefer kind puppets over mean ones, long before they can be taught religion. That's hard evidence that moral understanding can emerge naturally. So when Wielenberg says we don't need God to explain moral truth, he's not dodging the question. He's offering a view that actually fits what we see in the real world, where morality isn't handed down from above, but built from empathy, logic, and human connection. So here's what we want to know. Do you think morality should come from authority or from reason and empathy? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like if this made you think, and don't forget to subscribe for more philosophy, facts, and debates that actually matter.
The standards that I'm appealing to are, in a way, very intuitive. We have currently a major scientific project to look for life on other planets. Now, truth of it is, if we were to get information that on, let's say, the moon Europa, we found hieroglyphics, some interesting architectural structures, some apparent roving vehicles, this would settle the argument. Right away, we would conclude, as long as we didn't put them there, that there must be some other forms of life that have done that. If someone came along and said molecules of sand assembled themselves into all this, this would be an explanation, but a stupid one compared to the inference to intelligent design. So, in fact, the scientists say that even if we get radio signals in Morse code, they would be adequate to demonstrate the existence of intelligent life elsewhere. So my point is, let's apply the reasonable standard. If we see a fine-tuned universe, what's more likely? Someone fine-tuned it, or it fine-tuned itself? Could the universe have created itself out of nothing? Is there some alternative explanation for the data at hand? No. So I'm simply saying, let's go with the best explanation. By the way, my argument isn't eternal. If 20 years from now you had a scientific argument that was better, that said, hey, we figured it all out, I would go with that. I would have to drop this argument. I'm saying that in the current mode of knowledge and thinking, this is a successful explanation. You can't change the subject and say, well, now explain the Holocaust. That requires a different set of rebuttals. I would say the Holocaust is the product of free will. God didn't do the Holocaust, Hitler did. The Nazis did. To try to deflect blame to God for human action voluntarily undertaken is to minimize the human capacity for evil. But whether or not that argument works, it has nothing to do with the design argument. And finally, morality, very briefly. Again, if evolution could adequately account for morality, let's remember that the atheist premise is that we are evolved creatures in the world, and that's it. So evolution has to do a lot of work. It has to explain the human desire to give blood to strangers. If it can't do that, then it fails as an adequate explanation for a very important form of human behavior, morality, that is seen in every culture known to man. It requires explanation. I have an alternative explanation, that in human beings there are two parts. We are evolutionary creatures in the world. That explains why we desire sex and we desire food to survive, to reproduce. But then I have this other thing inside of me, what Adam Smith calls the impartial spectator. And that's another voice. And it's in me, but it's not of me. In fact, it's often stopping me from doing what I want to do. It's blocking my self-interest. Where does that come from? How does evolution account for that? So I'm saying that the God hypothesis casts more light on that subject, the hypothesis of a moral lawgiver. In fact, even the hypothesis of a life to come. You may say a final court in which our moral deeds will be adjudicated. Explains why we act the way we do now. Otherwise, our own behavior is incomprehensible to us. That's the strength of the presuppositional argument.
Well, because of religion's own very large claims. And because, it's something I didn't have time to go into, because not all these religions can be simultaneously true. I mean, there are enormous numbers of competing religions. It's another reason that it's obvious to me that they're man-made. It's what you would expect if it was man-made. There'd be lots of religions with incompatible claims and theologies, and that this would lead to further quarreling. Either one of them is completely true, as the Roman Church used to say, it was the one true church. Some of its members still do. Or all of them are false, or all of them are true, which of course can't be true. Now to Dinesh and the matter of anomalies and the question of ex nihilo. Half the time when I debate, it's people saying, nothing can come from nothing, you can't get something from nothing, so since there is something, someone must have wanted there to be something. Not, I think, a very impressive syllogism. I can't do it all this evening, but it's very easy for anyone to go and see Professor Lawrence Krauss deliver his brilliant lecture online called The Whole Universe from Nothing, which explains to you how indeed you can get very large numbers of things from nothing with the proper understanding of quantum theory. And then tonight Dinesh says, really there was nothing, and the Hebrews were so clever that they knew that. And therefore they must have been right about God as well. This is ridiculous. The ancient Hebrews also thought that God made man and women out of nothing or out of dust and clay, whereas we have an exact knowledge, or increasingly exact knowledge, of precisely the genetic materials in common with other creatures from which we were assembled. And then, not content with that, he says biblical prophecy is true in respect of Palestine. This is an extraordinary thing, and you were right to mention the Holocaust. If it's true that God wanted the Jews to get back to Palestine, then it must have been true that he wanted their exile to be ended, the galut, as it's known to Zionism, the exile, the wandering. And we know how that wandering was ended, by Christian Europe throwing living Jewish babies into furnaces. Well, that must be part of the plan then, mustn't it? And some rabbis used to claim that, by the way. They used to claim that the Holocaust was a punishment for exile. And then people started to desert the synagogue, so they shut up about it until the '67 war. And then when the Israeli army got the Wailing Wall back, they said, we shouldn't have spoken so quickly. Actually, this was what God always had in mind all along, the conquest by Jews of the Palestinians. Well, you see how brilliantly that's worked out. I don't think it's wise or moral or decent to try and detect the finger of God in human quarrels. I think the enterprise is futile, and it incidentally shows the absurdity of all arguments from design. Thank you.
Hitchens makes a strong point when he says the existence of many conflicting religions is exactly what we'd expect if they were man-made. Historically, we know that religions often reflect the geography, politics, and culture of their time. For example, Hinduism, Norse mythology, and Christianity all developed in isolation, making wildly different claims about gods, morality, and creation. They can't all be true, but they can all be human inventions. On the idea that something can't come from nothing, that's outdated thinking. Quantum physics shows that virtual particles appear and disappear in a vacuum with no cause. Lawrence Krauss explains in A Universe from Nothing that space, time, and even matter can emerge from quantum fluctuations. The universe doesn't need a creator. It needs laws of physics, which we have evidence for. And on the fine-tuning claim, that's misleading. The observable universe is mostly empty, dark, and hostile to life. If anything, it looks like a system that barely supports life, not one designed for it. Life adapted to the universe, not the other way around.
Well, was it to me first? Well, in that case, I can start with a compliment to Dinesh, because in one of his books, he tells the story of asking his father in India, Daddy, everyone around here seems to be Hindu, with quite a few Muslims. Why are we Christians? And his father said, because, Dinesh, my lad, the Portuguese Inquisition got to this part of India first. Which is, in fact, the full and complete explanation for that.
Actually,
so you can tell Dinesh was very well brought up in this respect, and he's made the most of it. Obviously, in my case, this does not apply because obviously, if you ask someone in Buffalo, why did you go to the Roman Catholic Church, he'll say, because my parents were from Poznan. It's the overwhelmingly probable explanation. Why did you go to a Greek Orthodox Church? My parents were born in Thessaloniki. Of course this is true, but there are a lot of people who convert. In fact, quite a large number of Muslims on their way out of Islam embrace Christianity, which is a very risky thing to do. It must be something they care a lot about, and I think one should take seriously. And though it was relatively easy for me, being born in England and emigrating to America, to leave the Church of England behind, that, believe me, is no sweat. Our great religious poet, our great Christian poet, George Herbert, refers to the sweet mediocrity of our native church. What do you get if you cross an Anglican with the Jehovah's Witness? Someone who comes to your door and bothers you for no particular reason. So, enough from me.
well, I think we have an environmental explanation for Christopher's skepticism. He was raised in a religion that was based on the family values of Henry VIII. Enough said. Now, with regard to with regard to the Indian explanation, his explanation is true but incomplete. And here's the point. My grandfather did say that to me, and I began to read Indian history. And I realized that a handful of Portuguese missionaries, inquisitorial or not, would have a pretty hard time converting hundreds of thousands of people. And Indian historians who look at it have a better explanation. It's called the caste system. See, if you were born into the Hindu caste system and you were one of the guys on the lower rungs of the ladder, to put it somewhat bluntly, you were screwed. It didn't matter what merit you had, you couldn't rise up, and neither could your children. So along come these greedy missionaries, and maybe they had swords, but the truth of it is a lot of Indians were very eager to get out of the caste system. They didn't need the swords. They rushed into the arms of the missionaries because they promised something that the Hindus couldn't, universal brotherhood. It wasn't always practiced, but even the idea of it, the principle of it, was hugely appealing. And that's why there were mass conversions not only to Christianity, but also to Islam, which makes a similar promise. So this is the historical landscape. A final point about this is that we're committing here what could be called a genetic fallacy. We do it with religion. We always can see the fallacy if we apply it to any other area. For example, it is very probable that there are more people who believe in Darwin's theory of evolution who come from Oxford, England, than who come from Oxford, Mississippi. It's probably equally true that there are more people who believe in Einstein's theory of relativity who come from New York than who come from New Guinea. What does this say about whether Einstein's theory is correct or no? Nothing. The origins of your ideas have no bearing on whether they're true or not. So wherever Christopher and I got our ideologies or our religious convictions, you should weigh our arguments on the merits. Thank you.
Thank you both.
Mr. D'Souza, you mentioned that you would only speak basically in secular terms, in terms of defending your faith without appealing to revelation or anything of that sort. Do you feel that there is an advantage for the world population at large for religious people to be required to defend their faith in such a venue, or do you feel that we would be better off if you had the luxury of only defending your faith within congregations of the faithful and without counterpart skeptics to demand that sort of intellectual line?
I've argued that I think that Christians need to learn to be bilingual. And by that I mean to speak perhaps two languages, a Christian language at home or in church, and a more secular language in the public square. Not because we want to wear two faces, but because we want to make our arguments accessible to people who may not share our assumptions. And so a lot of times, if someone says, what do you think about gay marriage? The Christian opens to the book of Leviticus, not recognizing that the person he's talking to does not recognize the authority of Leviticus to decide the matter. So it becomes a futile enterprise, two ships in the night. The only way to have debate is to meet on some common ground. And in that sense, I think in a democratic society, the common ground of reason is a perfectly appropriate language for democratic discourse. So what we're doing here is a secular intellectual enterprise. If I was speaking, as I sometimes do, in a megachurch or at a Catholic event, I might speak in a little different language, but that's because I'm speaking to an audience with different assumptions.
Hitchens is right to point out that most people follow the religion of their parents. It's geography and culture, not truth, that shapes belief. If you're born in Pakistan, you'll probably be Muslim. If you're born in Italy, Catholic. That alone should make us pause before declaring any one religion right. Now, D'Souza brings up caste as a reason for mass conversions in India. But this doesn't prove Christianity is true. It shows how social inequality can make oppressed people more open to any system that promises dignity. The same pattern happened with Islam and even communism. People seek escape, not necessarily truth. And calling that a genetic fallacy misses the point. Of course, ideas should be judged on merit. But when most people inherit religion instead of choosing it freely, that matters. Unlike science, which demands evidence and can be tested, religion often discourages doubt. Hitchens' argument isn't about where ideas come from. It's about how they spread. And on that, the evidence is clear. Belief is mostly born, not earned.
It is true that one can always, by re-rigging the assumptions, create new probabilities. So, for example, there are many physicists who have computed that if you look at all the particles of matter in the entire universe, the chance of them randomly assembling to produce a cell is essentially zero. However, you can increase that probability by adding universes. And there are many cosmologists who say, well, what if there are 1,000 universes or an infinity of universes? Then, in the infinity of time, and that's a problematic statement in itself, but with an infinity of universes, an infinity of transactions, even improbable events do occur. The problem with that is you can call it not only a scandalous violation of Occam's razor, it's essentially syllogistic promiscuity. Because what is the evidence that there is even one other universe other than our own? Empirically, none. You're essentially making up universes to account for the anomalies of the universe we have. So, which is more likely? It's almost as if the atheist, to try to abolish one invisible God, has to fabricate an infinity of invisible universes. I mean, I'd like to believe that, but frankly, I don't have that much faith.
The person violating the principle of William of Ockham here, I think, though, Dinesh, is you. I mean, everyone remembers what Laplace said to Napoleon when he produced his, he was the greatest scientist of his day, his orrery, the solar system as viewed from the outside, never been done before in model form. And the emperor said, well, there doesn't seem to be any God in this apparatus. And Laplace said, well, Your Majesty, it happens to operate perfectly well without that assumption. So it does. Dinesh asked earlier, and I should have taken him up on it, isn't it the case that to the three questions, where are we coming, where are we from, where are we going, and why are we here, there are three nopes from our side. That's not true at all. It was incredible that he alleged it. So the question of where are we from, both in the macro and the micro term, where did we come from? The cosmological, the Big Bang, and the micro, the unraveling of the human string of DNA and our kinship with other animals and indeed other forms of non-animal life. We are enormously to enormously greater extent well informed about our origins. And what we don't know, we don't claim to know. Very important. My admitting that I don't know exactly how it began is not at all the same as Dinesh's admission that he doesn't know either, because he feels he has to know. Because if it's not a matter of faith and it's not a matter of God, he can't say he believes in it a little bit. It must be a real belief to be genuine, and it must have some explanatory value. And he doesn't hold it very strongly, and it doesn't explain anything for which we have better explanations. Likewise about where we are going. We have a very good idea now of the time and place, if you like, the time anyway, when our universe and our sun, and indeed the cosmos, will come to an end. Dinesh might say, well, then if you look at the Bible, it proves right all those who said the end of the world is at hand. There's biblical authority. In fact, it just proves we were right all along. Yes, except that they said that by repenting, you could prevent this outcome, which you cannot, ladies and gentlemen. Okay? As to why are we here, good question, to which there's so far no perfect answer, and I suggest you keep the argument about that open and sharpen the questions and consider the infinite possible variety of answers and train your mind that way. Don't say you already know why you're here, that someone wants you to be here, that you're fathered, that you're protected, that it's all part of a divine plan. You can't know that, and you shouldn't say it. There.
I want to get back to the basics of this debate. And Professor D'Souza, you touched on this a little bit using the free will argument. I want to know how you can reconcile your statement that belief is a good thing when so many lives have been lost due to the differing opinions of religious views.
That is true, although historically greatly overstated. The Inquisition. When I was a student at Dartmouth, if you had asked me how many people were killed in the Inquisition, I would have said hundreds of thousands, maybe millions, horrible blot on Western history. Truth of it is, these things are now carefully studied. Henry came in as a multi-volume study of the Inquisition. Spanish Inquisition was the worst. And over 350 years, the number of people killed in the Inquisition was fewer than 2,000. Now, 2,000 people, 350 years, it works out to about 5 guys a year. Not normally considered a world historical crime. Now, is that 2,000 too many? Yes. But my point is that while the atheists are often crying crocodile tears over the crimes of religion, crimes that, by the way, often occurred 500 or 1,000 years ago, what about the vastly greater crimes of atheist regimes committed in our own lifetime in the last century, and they are still going on? If you take Hitler, Stalin, and Mao alone, the three of them collectively in the space of a few decades killed close to 100 million people. And that's the tip of the iceberg. What about Ceausescu, Kim Jong-il, Fidel Castro, Pol Pot? Pol Pot, he's a junior league atheist. Normally you don't even name the guy. But his Khmer Rouge regime in Indochina, following the Vietnam War, kills about 2 million in about 3 years. 2 million! Even bin Laden in his wildest dreams doesn't even come close. So I'm all for looking at the historical record, but let's look at it fairly and not blame religion for crimes when there are vastly greater and more recent crimes committed by atheist regimes. Let's look at all sides of the ledger.
There's a factual and a theoretical comment to be made on that. First, I think you're flat out wrong on the Inquisition. Not that the numbers game is crucial, but the Inquisition in the Americas caused Father Bartolomeo de las Casas to convene a great meeting at the University of Salamanca to consider whether the Christian world should ever have gone as conquistadors, because the genocidal price paid by the people of old Colombia, pre-Colombia, was so high. Slavery, torture, burning. No one knows what the numbers are, but they're horrifying. The second, the 30 Years' War has to be considered a war of religion, and we don't know how many people were killed there either, but the retarding of civilization was absolutely gigantic, as well as the appalling harvest of innocent population. Third, at the beginning of the First World War, a clash of empires, all of the imperial leaders were, in a sense, theocrats. The Ottoman Empire was a theocracy by definition. Kaiser Wilhelm II was the head of the Protestant Church in Germany. The Tsar of Russia was the head of the Russian Orthodox Church in Russia. The King Emperor of Britain, George V, was the head of the Church of England, as you say, rightly founded on the family values of Henry VIII. Civilization has not recovered from the retarding process of that war either. In fact, we never will get over what happened in that war. And those are wars of religion. Just to stay with the point of fact and on the secular, the allegation that the other killers are secular. Of the first one you mentioned, Adolf Hitler, it has to be said that I can almost give you the page reference of Mein Kampf, where he says that his desire to slaughter the Jews is because his fealty to the work of the Lord. He regards it as a holy cause. That's in Mein Kampf. Maybe he doesn't have the authority to say that, but you can't call him secular. On the belt buckle of every Nazi soldier, it read, Gott mit uns, every single one of them, God on our side. Just as the Confederacy had Deo Vindice as its official motto in the Civil War for slavery. It's been calculated by the Catholic historian Paul Johnson that up to 1/3 of the SS were confessing Catholics. If you change the word fascism, if you take it out of the history of the 1930s, just remove it, pretend it doesn't exist, call it a propaganda word, insert instead extreme Christian right wing, you have not to alter, you don't have to alter a thing about the spread of fascism from Portugal through Spain, across to Croatia, to Slovakia, where the head of the Nazi puppet regime was a priest in holy orders, Father Tiso. Vichy, Austria, you know the story, or if you don't, you should. Or anyone here who considers himself a Catholic should know that. This is not, I'm sorry to say, ladies and gentlemen, secularism. Of the others, I would actually say Pol Pot had a very extreme idea of a restoration of the old Buddhist authority known as the Angkar. But let me not quarrel too much. What was wrong with these heroic mass murderers? That they all thought that they could bring about an ultimate history. They all thought that with them, history would be consummated. History would in fact come to an end. They were messianic. The whole problem to begin with is the idea that human beings can be perfected by force, or by faith, or by conquest, or by inquisition. That can take an explicitly religious form or just another messianic form, but it reinforces the point I began with. Take nothing for certain. Don't believe in any absolutism. Don't believe in any totalitarianism. Don't ask for any supreme leader in the sky or on earth, for that way lies madness and torture and murder, and always will.
Hitchens is right to point out that the worst atrocities in history were driven not just by ideology, but by certainty, the belief that some higher cause justifies inhuman actions. Religion has a long track record of this. The 30 Years' War alone killed over 8 million people in the name of competing Christian doctrines. The Crusades, colonial missionary violence, and forced conversions during the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions wiped out entire cultures. The numbers are often minimized by apologists, but that's not honesty, it's revisionism. D'Souza falsely equates secular authoritarianism with atheism. Stalin's regime didn't kill in the name of atheism. It killed to maintain power, just like the Christian monarchies that did the same with divine right. And Hitler wasn't an atheist. His writings and speeches often invoked God, providence, and divine mission. The Nazi Party signed a concordat with the Vatican in 1933 and was supported by many Catholic leaders. Their motto, Gott mit uns, God with us, was stamped on every soldier's belt buckle. And about science, yes, the multiverse is a theory. But unlike God, it's derived from real physics. Quantum field theory, cosmic inflation, and string theory all predict the possibility of multiple universes. No faith needed, just math, observation, and peer review. Hitchens' warning is simple. Belief in unquestionable truths, whether religious or political, creates the conditions for totalitarianism. History proves him right. Do you think society is safer when people admit they don't know everything, or when they claim divine authority over everyone else? Comment your thoughts below. Like if this gave you something to think about, and subscribe for more content that challenges belief with reason.
Where do we get the idea for human rights and human equality? You cannot cut open a human being and discover in their DNA human equality. It's not the sort of thing that Plato or Aristotle believed in. Of course, there are citizens and there are barbarians, and there are males and there are females, and there are slaves and there are free people, and we live within a hierarchy. And as Bart has already said about the paterfamilias, there is a person at the top of that hierarchy who is in this priestly role, who has incredible rights over the lives and bodies of everyone else, within that structure. And I guess I begin the book with equality because I want to go back to Genesis 1 and say on page 1 in the beginning, we've got male and female in God's image to have dominion over the world. And I think that's a radically different creation account to the ancient Near Eastern accounts, to the Greek and Roman myths, to the Egyptian myths, in which there are chaotic forces at play and humanity are made as slaves for the gods. And in Genesis 1, you've got humanity as having dominion. It's God's world, but he puts humans in charge. So you have this incredible dignity that is given to the human person. And one of the people I reference in the book is Celsus in the 2nd century, a great critic of Christianity, who talks about the radical error of Jews and Christians. And radical error number 1 is this Hebrew idea that God uniquely blesses humans. Why should that be the case? Mm-hmm. But that radical error is compounded by the Christians who come along and say, not only does God uniquely bless humans, God uniquely becomes human in the person of Jesus. And so you've got this foundation for humanism in God the human. And no wonder you can get the Apostle Paul coming along later in Galatians and saying there's no male, nor female, slave, nor free, Jew nor Gentile, because we're all one in Christ Jesus. Modeled within the church, you start to get this idea of a different kind of family in which everyone, no matter their station, is a brother or a sister, and no one is Lord except Christ. And obviously, it takes a long time, like yeast working through dough, like the mustard seed growing, until we get modern ideas of equality. But I think very specifically, these have come from biblical and particularly Christian foundations.
Glenn points to Genesis and early Christian teachings as the foundation of equality. But that doesn't hold up when we look at the facts. The Bible, both Old and New Testament, clearly supports slavery, patriarchal dominance, and the subordination of women. In Exodus 21, slave ownership is explicitly regulated, not condemned. In the New Testament, Paul tells slaves to obey their masters. He doesn't call for abolition. Women are told to remain silent and submit. This isn't hidden. It was used to justify inequality for centuries. Christian empires ran the transatlantic slave trade. The church opposed women's suffrage. Even the idea of consent in marriage wasn't accepted until secular law overrode religious norms. The real turning point came during the Enlightenment. Thinkers like Voltaire, Paine, and Mary Wollstonecraft challenged religious authority and pushed ideas of freedom, equality, and universal rights, based on reason, not scripture. So no, modern human rights didn't come from Christianity. They emerged in spite of it, through centuries of struggle against the very hierarchies religion helped build. Let's hear what Bart has to say about that.
You know, when you go back to the creation stories, I think the most troubling thing is not Genesis 1, but Genesis 2, when you have the detailed description. I assume you're talking about the equality of humans, because Genesis 1 is not about equality of living beings, because the whole point is humans have the entire creation to be subject, subordinate to humans.
Dominion.
And so the question is, are men and women created equally? And I get your point from Genesis 1. When you have the account in Genesis 2 about how it actually happens, God first makes Adam and makes Adam a living being, and then Adam needs a helper, and so he creates all the animals, and these are to be his helpers. But it turns out there's no one suitable, so he makes a woman out of the man, an isha out of the ish in Hebrew, and she's to be his helper, his helpmate. That's why she exists. He does not come into being to help her. She comes into being to help him, and then she leads him astray, according to the biblical record. And this is the consistent motif throughout the Bible, is that women are to be subordinate to men. There are, it's massively evident when you read the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. And when in the New Testament, where you have somebody pick up this story from Genesis 2, it's in 1 Timothy chapter 5, where the author, claiming to be Paul, says that women are not to talk in church. They're to exercise no authority over a man. They're to be subject to men, because Eve was misled, not Adam. And this is what happens when women teach. They get misled by the devil and they lead the man astray. You get a similar thing in Paul himself in 1 Corinthians 14 about women are not to talk in church. So it's true that Galatians does say that in Christ there's no male or female or slave or free, and that's absolutely true, and it's absolutely important that he says that. But the two key words are in Christ. What he means is that everybody equally gets salvation. But Paul does not think that they are equal in the church. He tells the women in Corinth that they are to be subject to their husbands, just as the husbands are subject to God. And so the husband is their God. And so this is not equality on any social level. And if you look at the history of Christianity, I don't think anyone would look at the history of Christianity through late antiquity or the Middle Ages into the Reformation and would think that Christianity supported equality for all human beings. They simply didn't. It's not until the Enlightenment that comes about. And the people who developed this in the Enlightenment were not always Christians. In fact, most of them weren't Christian in any sense that you would recognize. And so you have I would agree, you have kind of the roots there. You have the roots in also other forms of ancient thought, though. I don't know if you've looked into Stoicism, but in the Stoic world also you have various traces of this. And so the Enlightenment does have earlier traces, but I don't think it's an exclusively Christian concept, and I don't think it's a particularly Christian concept, because in fact Christianity supports subordination, not equality.
Okay. Glenn, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, we might leave the 7 hours. Okay. So the fact that Adam comes first within the Genesis narrative means that he is more primitive, because we go from very simple things in Genesis to much more complex things. And in terms of Adam, we go from dust to man to woman. And she is, if Adam is the head of creation, Eve is the crown. And so I think if you just follow literarily what is going on in Genesis 1 and 2, you don't get the sense of Eve being a lesser, but actually a more developed creature than Adam is. And the fact that she is the helper, the Ezer, is that, you know, God is most commonly spoken of as our help, in that we cannot live without him. We need help. We desperately need help. And so the helper does not mean it's a diminutive role at all, I would say. And then it's interesting where does the feminist impulse come from? And you have said that Galatians is very important in that. I would say the treatment of women by Christ was radically countercultural in the day. That the marriage and family program, as Joseph Henrich has put the sort of the early church sexual ethic of the day, was radically equalizing in terms of its expectations of men and women. I get into this in my consent chapter, that if the sexual revolution of the 1960s equalized the sexes by saying women can be as freed as men have always been sexually, the first century sexual revolution was basically men must be as restricted as women have always been. And in a sense, very, very few things I would say have ever been as liberating for women and children than that first century sexual revolution, in which men are utterly restricted to the levels of modesty and chastity that were always expected of women. And I'm not saying that in the first century we have a fully blown sense of the UN Declaration of Human Rights or of any of that, but I am saying that exclusively and particularly it is a Christian understanding that is developing. And then when you get into the idea of, did these ideas come from the Enlightenment? I tend to think that that's more a creationist narrative, that sort of out of nowhere has come these ideas of equality without a backstory. And I would just encourage people to be more evolutionary in their thinking, in a theistic sense, that actually what was developed through the Enlightenment and on into the modern world were foundationally Christian views that I don't think you would get without those Christian foundations.
I mean, what do you just quickly say to the Bart saying the concept of equality was also floating around in Stoicism and other ancient forms of thought and philosophy? Perhaps it was just Christianity that kind of was the vehicle that really, you know, took it forward eventually because of the triumph of Christianity. But do you think it was there otherwise, Glenn?
You can point to all sorts of things that we look back now through glasses and through a prism that can point out things in all sorts of pre-Christian and non-Christian cultures that we can applaud, including, you know, any traces of equality that we see in Stoicism. I guess my question would be, why are we looking for those particular things? And I would say that the reason we're looking for those particular things is we're coming from an irreducibly Christian mindset that is looking for those particular things.
So can I respond to some of that, Justin?
Please.
I mean, I don't think it's irreducibly Christian, because if you're going to do an evolutionary model, of course, Christianity came out of other things too. It's not really fair to isolate Christianity, for example, apart from Judaism. And so you could just as well write the book saying that it's not a Christian model, it's a Jewish model. So I think that the lens you're looking at as a Christian theologian is Christianity, but if you look at it historically, I don't think it works. When you look, and I don't think the Enlightenment came out of nowhere at all. I think there definitely were roots, and some of them were Christian, and some weren't. As to Adam and Eve, though, I've got to say I don't think the logic works. I love the idea that Eve is the pinnacle. That God saved the best for last. That's great. But if you follow that logic, what you're saying is, first God creates the other animals to help Adam. And if he's more primitive than Eve because he was first, that means he's more primitive than the animals, which means that spiders and snakes and aardvarks are superior to humans in that scheme.
The animals are already there. He just hadn't named them.
No, God made them in order to help him. That's why he made.
God brought the animals to him, but
the animals are created.
after.
The animals are created. At least in the first chapter of Genesis, the animals get created on whatever it is, day 4 or 5.
I'm not talking about the first. As you know, look, this is another long issue. But Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 come from two different stories. Eve does not show up in Genesis 1. Adam and Eve show up in Genesis 2, and Glenn is presupposing Genesis 2, not Genesis 1, when he says that Eve came second. So I'm talking about what he's talking about, Eve coming second. She doesn't come second, she comes after the animals. And so if she's superior to Adam because she was made as his helper, the animals are made as his helpers.
They're not made. They were brought to him.
No,
they were brought to him. They weren't made.
Okay. No, I'm sorry. That God makes the animals in order to help Adam. He names them, but they're only after they're made.
Bart's completely right to highlight that Genesis 2 is deeply rooted in hierarchy, not equality. And the proof isn't just in the story, it's in how that story was used for centuries to justify male dominance and female subordination in Christian doctrine, law, and society. Take 1 Timothy 2:11-15, used for over 1,800 years to deny women leadership, silence them in church, and justify that their nature is more easily deceived. This wasn't fringe theology, it was mainstream. Influential figures like Augustine, Tertullian, and Aquinas all reinforced the idea that women were inferior by nature. Aquinas even wrote that women are defective and misbegotten men, a conclusion drawn straight from Christian interpretations of Genesis. The idea that Jesus introduced gender equality doesn't match the facts. There's no gospel record of Jesus calling for the end of patriarchy or slavery. He didn't challenge the legal inferiority of women, or say anything about women's rights to divorce, own property, or testify in court. Things women in Roman society were often denied. Glenn's claim that the early church equalized sexual expectations between men and women is misleading. The early Christian sexual ethic wasn't about freedom or fairness, it was about control, especially over women's bodies. Church fathers idealized virginity and celibacy, especially for women, and viewed sex even in marriage as suspect. Jerome, one of Christianity's most influential thinkers, said, "Nothing is so unclean as a woman's body." That's not a foundation of equality, that's institutional misogyny. And the idea that Christianity slowly evolved into modern human rights is revisionist. Real legal equality and consent laws didn't emerge from churches. They were won against the churches by secular thinkers during the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment didn't come out of nowhere, but its core principles, freedom of thought, bodily autonomy, equality before the law, often clashed with Christian orthodoxy. Thinkers like Spinoza, Hume, Voltaire, and Paine questioned divine authority and rooted human rights in reason and shared experience, not in divine revelation. That's where real equality began to take legal shape. Christian institutions resisted these ideas, sometimes violently. And even the idea of consent in marriage. The church didn't teach that marital rape was wrong until the late 20th century. In fact, marital rape was legal in most Christian countries until feminist, secular movements challenged the doctrine that wives owed sex to their husbands, a view grounded in centuries of Christian theology. So Glenn's idea that Christianity planted the seeds of equality just doesn't hold up. What history shows is that Christianity institutionalized hierarchy, and that human equality had to be wrestled out of its grip by people brave enough to question its authority.
Let's start with you here. Why do you believe that Christianity did give us that sense? And then we'll see what Bart has to say.
I think there is kindness and there's compassion in all sorts of pre-Christian and non-Christian cultures. So it's like I don't want to be heard to say that Christianity has a monopoly on kindness, on tender-heartedness, on love. But I think there is something unique about the highest becoming the lowest on the cross, in order that we, the lowest, might be brought into his hospitality. You know, if the way of all nature is the survival of the fittest and the sacrifice of the weakest. The Christian story is the sacrifice of the fittest, Christ, so that we, the weakest, might survive. And I think whereas in the realm of nature it is tit for tat, in the realm of nature it is nature red in tooth and claw, there is something supernatural about the way of Christ. There's something against nature. There is something that says, I will protect the weakest. And obviously it was something that a critic of the church like Nietzsche hated. He saw the cross as the transvaluation of all values. Because, of course, nature teaches us that the weak, the low, and the botched should perish, and we shall help them to do so, he says in the Antichrist. And therefore, Christians have always, he thought, stood in the way of a proper humanitarian ideal. And the proper humanitarian ideal is we can all fly off to become Übermensch. We can all fly off to greater heights of humanity if we let the poor, the weak, the low, and the botched, as he called them, perish so that we can, evolve to a higher degree. I think the revulsion that we feel at that sentiment is a particularly Christian revulsion. And it is born of some particularly Christian intuitions. I think we've been looking at a picture of the Lord on the cross for thousands of years, and we have held that up as our image of what it is to be great. And whoever will be greatest among you must serve, and the first shall be last, and all that kind of stuff that Jesus taught. I think we have been formed, whether we've been to church or not, all of us have been formed by an image of greatness in sacrifice, and even shameful sacrifice on the cross for the sake of the other, which I think gives a bite to a Christian understanding of compassion.
And how, just before we come back to Bart, was that, in your view, shown in practical ways by the early Christian church?
Hospitals, for instance, would be an interesting place to go. Now that the Greeks had their manuals of how Galen's 4 humours and how to be a physician and to help people, and the Romans had their sort of sick bays for the slaves and the soldiers, but that was to restore them to economic and military fruitfulness. The idea of hospitals for the weak and the poor and the sick who could not afford it became a very much a Christian thing that happened, and there was a cascade of hospitals that sort of happened from the 4th century onwards. Would be one kind of thing, or standing against abortion and infanticide, and not simply standing against abortion and infanticide, but taking the exposed infants and raising them in orphan care and that sort of thing. That would be another way of actually standing against the way of nature.
I mean, it's interesting, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, Bart, that in those pagan cultures, it was illegal, essentially, to abandon and expose, as it was called, infants who were unwanted economically, or because they were malformed or whatever it was. And as I understand it, Christians became to be known for people who would go to those places where they were traditionally left and took them in and adopted them and so on. For this is a part of a big picture that Glenn believes goes back to this idea of the God who was willing to be sacrificed and kind of upheld the poor and the lowly and so on over the powerful. What's your view on that as being the kind of the linchpin for where this central virtue of compassion as a value came from in Western culture?
I've got 2 things to say about it. One is this is the one area of Glenn's book that I completely agree with in most ways. I would put it differently. The way not contradictorily, just a different way. My different way of thinking about it is, I actually deal with this in this book that just came out with Yale about my journeys to the afterlife, because some of them deal with these issues and the issue is that in the Roman world generally, the ancient world generally, the world generally, the ideology was one of dominance. that whoever was dominant, there were no ethical problems with the person who was dominating somebody. That's what they were supposed to do. And so a powerful village there was no ethical problem with destroying the village next door, if you're more, and killing all the men and enslaving all the women. There wasn't an ethical problem with that. Or empires. And so you can read through the moral discourses of Romans and Greeks, and they don't problematize that. They don't problematize slavery. Of course, I mean, the master is supposed to be master of the slave, and so slavery is fine. Yeah, of course. They're usually prisoners of war in the ancient world. It wasn't a race thing. It's just, you enslave people. And men were to dominate women, economically, socially, culturally, politically, sexually. And so it was all domination, and Jesus preached service. And it was completely contrary to what the dominant paradigm was that you're to serve others and to live for and to help the poor. And that's when, in the ancient world, if you had a lot of money and if you had to give some away or you did give some away, it was always to somebody on your same socioeconomic class, or to build a public building, or to put on a gladiatorial show or something like. It was for your own, to promote your own status. The idea of helping the poor was like unheard of. It's like, are you kidding me? That's a joke. No, you're not going to help the poor. And so I completely agree with that is a paradigm shift. It's not the case that everybody accepted the paradigm. A lot of Christians were going around saying, yeah, Jesus said to sell everything. He didn't really mean it. And so, you get a lot of that. And people are people. But you do get the shift in how preachers preached it. The other thing I would say, though, is that it doesn't originate with Christianity. Jesus is pulling on the Old Testament prophets. It originates with Judaism. What Christianity did is it took over the world. And so this Jewish idea of love your neighbor as yourself became a dominant paradigm in the West, at least theoretically, because of Christianity. I agree with that. And it's true, you get hospitals and you get orphanages, and you get the weird idea that you're concerned about the destitute. Ancient pagans talk about it and they say, what? No, we're not doing that.
Bart makes two important points here, and they both stand up to history. First, the idea that caring for the poor and weak was some radical new Christian invention just isn't true. That moral shift began long before Jesus, in Judaism through prophets like Isaiah, Amos, and Micah, who condemned the rich for exploiting the poor and called on the people to care for widows, orphans, and the oppressed. Jesus was teaching in that tradition, not creating something new. Second, even when Christianity became dominant, it didn't consistently follow its own ideals. Yes, some Christians rescued infants, built hospitals, and preached compassion. But these were exceptions, not norms. For most of church history, the poor were still exploited, slavery was normalized, and church institutions amassed enormous wealth while preaching humility. Even monastic hospitals, which Glenn praises, were often limited to serving other Christians, sometimes only clergy, and could exclude the very people Jesus supposedly came to help. The compassion that survived did so because people, not institutions, fought to keep it alive. And let's not forget, many non-Christian cultures also built systems of care. In India, Buddhist monastic hospitals predate Christian ones. In China, Confucian ethics promoted caring for the vulnerable. The idea that only Christianity cared for the weak is not just inaccurate, it's dismissive of the full human story. Bart is right. Christianity spread a Jewish ethic, but it didn't originate it, and it often failed to practice it. The values we hold today, compassion, consent, equality, were won through a long, difficult evolution, often in spite of religion, not because of it. What do you think? Do you believe religion is necessary for morality? Or can human values grow without it? Let us know in the comments. And if this gave you something to think about, like, subscribe and share to keep the conversation going.